Thank you everybody for being here. As you know, we have this semester our lecture series. It's called Critical Practice. It's a continuation of the last semester. And we are pleased today to welcome somebody that everybody knows.
Everybody here knows, yeah.
Everybody knows. The speakers, my presentation won't be long, but it's important to recognize Professor Uihlein. She'll be today presenting some really exciting work that she has been doing, which is the publishing of her latest book, The Elements of Construction, looking at somebody very prominent in architecture, but also very, very, very important for our school, worker, all sort of the process that he took to sort of change and talk about what architecture education is, and then also sort of give us a history of what we're studying today. So it's important to sort of bring this history out into life, have this conversation, have this presentation. And it is incredibly important also to give the stage to somebody who has taught many students, which is very fantastic. And also sort of continuing this presence of construction history in this school. So Professor Uihlein, as you know, is associate professor here, and also the associate director for research. So also us as faculty very much learn a lot. And she has been a great asset for all of us. So I will leave it as a very formal sort of intro, but I really want to sort of give a hand to Professor Uihlein for coming in today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here, and it's lovely to see so many wonderful student faces and my colleagues. So obviously we're going to talk about the elements of construction, and I'm going to read some notes so that I can have some cogent thoughts, just so putting that out there. Okay, so it all started with the discovery of this volume, and it's labeled A Textbook Used for Several Years by Ricker. Right, and so to my surprise, the head of the architecture school in the 19th century had composed an architectural construction textbook. In 1875, architecture schools were few, and architectural textbooks were fewer. So Ricker set out to write one. The Elements of Construction that we'll talk about today is his unpublished textbook for the construction courses at the University of Illinois. It represents his educational philosophy and his influence in architecture. It also represents how he looked at things in a moment of change. The Elements of Construction was originally in 2 volumes, but it was always an evolving work. And so 3 projects in this book give us a date of this work. So we found in the archives, it's not dated. We know that it moves around. The first is William LeBaron Jennings Fair Building on the right, which opened in 1892, the engineering building, which was dedicated on the university campus in 1894, and then better known Manhattan Life Insurance Building was 1894. So we know that at least the version that we have is 1894, excuse me. So the date of this is significant because there's lots of change going on in Chicago and in the construction industry. And so Ricker, as the good educator he was, had to try to incorporate everything within this textbook. And the textbook was intended to aid future architects who were designing in rural areas. He would mention Iowa, but in quote unquote important buildings in the city. And so the textbook reflects this remarkable moment of construction technologies being tested and new knowledges being created. The first volume, which is not of my book, but is important nonetheless, is Strength of Materials. So of those students I have tortured, this is the kind of stuff that Ricker was teaching in the 1870s. The first volume also contains wood, and you can see here a diagram for a wood roof, carpentry, joinery, stairs. It also built on the topics about shop practice that we taught here for years, which I'll talk about later. So Ricker's textbook was constructed through something called the blue process, right? And so this is actually a negative, right? And so the negatives were composed on trace paper with ink or typed. This page was then put on top of another page that was chemically treated and that would sit in the sun for 2 to 3 minutes at a time to print it, which is amazing as we think about today. So a university document talks about this method. The document was in 1881, excuse me, and said that we began to use this method in 1878. Architecture was an early adoption, but by 1885, 30,000 pages were being printed a year at 2 minutes at a time in the sun, right? And so University of Illinois had departments such as zoology and military sciences using this besides us. And so this is the blueprinted version, and I have a photocopy of it. I'll pass it around in a bit. The benefit of printing this rather than publishing is that it could be updated annually. It could be updated regularly, right? And so Ricker would say, fresh and abreast with the progress of science, including the latest construction details or translations of scientific work. The blue process thus allowed students to gain the latest information at a speed that kept up with the changes of the construction industry that were happening with the introduction of steel and ultimately the formation of skyscrapers. The sources for the information were timely, but it also meant that this work was never published. It was never static, right? So it was always changing. And so Ricker did and could update it when he liked. And so the book, the second volume, which is what is the focus of the book here, had these divisions: foundations, stone and masonry, bricks, terracotta, tiles, and terracotta, which of course was important for fireproof construction, iron, and you'll notice steel construction, right? So he's mentioning steel construction in that title. So for each one of these materials, Ricker does Ricker. He's got the what, why, how, and so what of each material. So he's talking about subtypes of materials. He's talking about types of mortars, cements, what might influence an architect in their use and their choice, and he even draws out tools to be used in construction. There's a whole page on stone cutting tools. So the plates accompanied the text, so there's a series of plates, and so we'd have stone cutting tools, stone masonry forms, brick coursing, iron and steel forms on a series of about 20 plates. So just as the text could be supplemented, so could the images. And so you see on the top we have 12B. So this was inserted at some point. He also removed several of these, right? And so what's remarkable about this volume is it encapsulates how buildings were built at the time when everything was changing, including construction and how we educated an architect. So why was construction important to Ricker? So let's look at the man, and Clifford Ricker. So he was born in 1853, died in 1924. He was one of the early educators in the entire United States. His role at the University of Illinois began in 1873. We'll talk about that in a minute. And when he retired in 1916, he had served as the head of the School of Architecture for 37 years, dean of the College of Engineering for 27 years, and the chair of the Illinois State Board of Examiners for 17 years. So while leading the School of Architecture during his tenure, it is estimated that he educated a quarter of all architecture students across the country at the time. It should be noted that the University of Illinois was the only architecture school outside of the East Coast until the 1890s. Ricker was born and raised in Maine in a farming community that he said allowed some but limited education. He noted having few books to read and none to borrow. He attended both his family farm and worked on a family mill. He learned in school and on his own. He had a habit of studying at night and educating himself. This allowed him to gain expertise in subjects like Latin, biology, and geology. He further developed skills in his work with wood. So he had a position in a factory that made piano cases. He performed carpentry for building construction, and he co-owned a blacksmith shop. And so Ricker described the blacksmith shop as hard but practical labor, fixing wagons, carriages, and farm tools in La Harpe, Illinois, Western Illinois. In 1869, Ricker met a student from the Illinois Industrial University, the original name for our university, and heard of this student's experiences. So then he sold his shares in the wagon shop and headed off to the University of Illinois. He arrived at the Illinois Industrial University at midnight on January 2nd, 1870, at the age of 26. Unbeknownst to him, Champaign-Urbana would be his home for the remainder of his life. So here we have Vet Hall and Experimental Hall. In 1870, Champaign was growing. Not that you can see that in this image. Right? The publication Illinois Farmer proclaimed in 1864 that Champaign was on the move, with new buildings springing up, facilities for making money, and a place to start a family, right? Which is not true of all farm towns. And so the state itself, as we know in Illinois, was being aided by industry, technology, and infrastructure. When Ricker arrived, there was only one building on the newly formed campus, the old university building. And we know that it had been funded by, startup of the university had been funded by the Morrill Act. It had 50 students in March 1868. And of course, the Morrill Act tells us we're going to do engineering and agriculture. John Milton Gregory, who was the first university regent, intended to combine this with the arts. And so architecture and a course in architecture and fine arts was placed within the Polytechnic department within engineering and mining. By 1870, when Ricker joined the campus, the student population had tripled. Ricker described his classmates as mature and earnest. He chose to do the course of architecture. And so what we see here is the course of architecture in its full description at its time in 1870. right? And so the catalog was the program was only loosely conceived, and it really mirrored the newness of architectural education. So we might remind ourselves that there was that institute in Massachusetts that started in 1865. We were in 1868, and Cornell was third in 1871. Harold Hansen we know, is the first architectural faculty member for Ricker. He was a European-born and European-trained architect, and he made a fuller development of the architectural curriculum and his hiring. Here's a project by Ricker from 1872 as a student. This is all by hand, students. This is all done by hand, right? And so this is a core and exchange building. Here's another project that Ricker did. So Ricker we think these projects were likely completed under Hansen in winter term of 1872. Due to his initiative and self-study, he would have been able to graduate in the spring of 1872. However, there was a small thing called the Great Chicago Fire, right? And so Ricker went up in October 71 with the university Corps cadets, first just to act as a security unit. He witnessed the destruction, and then he returned to the Champaign a few days later. In the summer of 1872, Ricker returned to Chicago and worked for an architect, John W. Roberts. Ricker specifically calls out working on this building, which I was delighted to find. And he said that Ricker reflected on the vast needs for buildings in Chicago. It was indeed a great practical training, and perhaps not equal since the burning of Rome. So Ricker then returns to campus in fall of 1873, and Hansen, his instructor, had moved to Chicago. So there was no instructor. So University Regent asked Ricker to become an instructor for the program. So Ricker is not only to teach his classmates architectural curriculum, but he was to complete his own work, right? So he had to teach himself so that he could finish the degree. So in 1873, Ricker becomes an educator. On March 12, 1873, the Board of Trustees awarded Ricker his scholarship for a full course of architecture, making him the first within the United States to receive a university degree in architecture, with graduates of MIT and Cornell following 3 months later, and they're still mad about it, I'm just saying. Gregory noted with Ricker his practical and previous quote-unquote mechanical experience, i.e. his hands-on experience in wood. The time that Ricker had spent in construction in the wagon shop gave Ricker valuable insights into the knowledge that was needed for architectural education. I love this. However, before he became a teacher, he had to visit Europe. So Regent Gregory wanted him to visit Europe. So Ricker and Gregory sailed for Europe in March of 1873. The Bau Academy is his first stop in Berlin, right? And so there's conversations whether Ricker is following the Polytechnic model or the Beaux-Arts model, and he's clearly has affinity with the German model. And this choice is actually because Hansen was trained at the Bau Academy, so there was some inspiration to go there. Ricker also went to Vienna, Prague, Dresden, Paris, Glasgow, and London. During this trip, importantly, Ricker attended the 1873 Vienna's World Fair, where he noted the technical education through shop practices exhibited by Russia and Victor Delafosse. As Gregory had hoped, the European experiences had influenced Ricker and his approach to education. Here are sketches on trace paper from that 1873 trip. Right? It's like if all the people you know in Barcelona now making sketches in a sketchbook, we've kept these since 1873. And so upon returning to campus in 1873, Ricker became the permanent instructor, and he was the only faculty member until 1891. And so within his first term, he revised the architectural curriculum. In addition to his administrative and teaching duties, he designed 5 buildings on campus. Now this is the chemistry building in Harker Hall. And from his accounting, even as a student, he had used his skills in the wood shop to improve campus conditions as a student and as an architect. And of course, Ricker was a lead on the Altgeld Hall, our famous hall. Of this project, Ricker said, except for the mosaics, architecture students and architecture department had everything to do with this building. And so here we are as Ricker as in the instructor. You can see him in the middle. As evident in the background, Ricker knew the importance of construction in the creation of architecture. He had designed campus buildings. He had supervised their construction. He had built buildings himself, fixed wagons, had carpentry skills. And then all of this was reinforced by his long trip to Europe, and his conviction grew with his teaching experience. So this is a redrawing of one of the images in the book, which we had to do for the publication of the new book. Ricker believed that one had to learn the elements before they could advance their skills in architecture design. Construction knowledge was essential to protecting not only the public safety, but the integrity of the profession. As an educator, he thought it was his responsibility to implement these values. Underlying some of the emphasis on construction was Ricker's belief that he served the university, the state of Illinois, and the students themselves. Ricker was rather plain-spoken on the subject and noted it was his responsibility to train all students for a career. The state, he said, had the right to demand the proper training of their sons and daughters, and students deserves training in some useful pursuit. Knowledge of construction, structure, heating, and ventilation systems provided this background, Ricker thought. And so we have the courses themselves, but we also have written descriptions of the program for future students that Ricker would have written, right? And so the first goal is full and thorough knowledge of scientific principles of construction. We're going to notice the emphasis on scientific and how that reflected in the growing belief of the power of science at the time, and would have supported University John Milton Gregory's vision of the university to use the new era of science to enlighten industrial classes. The second one was the focus on practical skills for the profession, drawing specifications and estimates. Design and drawing buildings were essential preparations for those entering the profession of architecture. And the third was practical knowledge of construction in all its forms by a full course in shop practice. Through shop practice came comfortability with acquiring skills of the trades. Ricker thought construction methods and construction means and materials were of a place and of a knowledge that could lead to development of American architecture while serving the growing profession. Simultaneously, Ricker had been serving as dean in the College of Engineering, and he saw that architects had to be technically trained because engineers knew nothing about buildings. And so, controversial as that may be, so Ricker's guiding principles led him to instill construction structures and materials as defining characteristics of architectural education at the University of Illinois. So besides being able to draw a detail for every portion of the building, Ricker believed that there was beauty that could be found in the systems and that the systems contributed to the overall design. Other institutions provide further distinction about why Illinois was different than what was happening at the time. And by 1888, there were 6 schools of architecture. The first 5 were established, and the university education for architects was in its second decade of education, right? So previously and currently, even at the time, apprenticeship remained, but the American Architect and Building New declared that the advantage of the school training for architects had become generally appreciated, and the time is quite right for the university to take its position that graduates must be thoroughly equipped to rise to the highest levels of the profession. And so in the same year, in 1888, the American Architect and Building News ran a series of articles, you see one here, about architectural education in the United States, and they analyzed MIT, Illinois, Cornell, and Columbia, and they provide details, interesting details that we can't find in curricular descriptions today. The programs at MIT, Columbia, and Syracuse incorporated trips to building construction sites, access to professional offices. Ricker also often lamented about this, that the students of Illinois, in the center of the cornfields, as we are now, did not have access to first-class city buildings, and thus the character of the program had to be different. Architecture had better come to the university through their instructors, images, and books. Knowledge of science was an important component of the practice of architecture, and was incorporated in each of 5 of the programs, including Syracuse, which was an art-based program. Strengths and materials, mechanics, roof structures, heating, and ventilation were addressed at all of the schools at some point at this time. Illinois was different from other schools due to a number of hours and dedication to construction education. So here you see Cornell, MIT, in a very traditional spreadsheet, and look at the theory of construction in Illinois, right? It's nearly 3 times the other. And then you can also see on the far right, shop practice. We have 0, 0, and then 360 hours, right? And so Ricker's intentions was clear. And he sent a report into the AIA Committee on Education in 1887, and he said, "A great mistake is often made by the instructor in requiring so-called original designs from pupils who had never absorbed any ideas of form or detail to work up, with the sole result of permanently disabling the original power of the students. They wished him to run before he could stand alone." The journal was very specific in asking about shop practice. The other programs came back and said shop practice was the practice of architecture and construction, and architects only needed to know the theory of it. Shop practice Illinois was 3 terms, and it sort of refined and matured. The first course was, so all students had to do this in their first year. The first course was carpentry and joinery. The second was cabinet making and turning. And the third was building portions of a building at scale. So we think those are roofs and stairs and things like that. So the intention behind this 350 hours was to allow the students to deeply explore a single trade and material. And Ricker recognized it was not appropriate nor possible for architects to become fully skilled in one trade. However, he intended to use one trade as an exemplar that students could then extrapolate to other things. And so the shop classes themselves would be hosted in our carpentry shop and what was our turreted building that no longer exists. And so this was achieved by making an object with proper tools and materials repeatedly, and this is a method that he got from Della Voss at the World's Fair in Vienna. And it was a learning process to help students refine their abilities and conceive what could be built. If you understood the material, then when you drew your detail, you knew how to draw that detail. Remarkably, we have over 40 assignments that exist from these 3 classes, which is amazing. And so for the first term, we have almost a complete set, 1 through 25. They appear mostly to be in Ricker's hand, although not all of them. And so one of Ricker's contributions here was to make the students work off of drawings, because he said if students were drawing drawings and communicating to the contractor, then they should be able to read their drawings and build themselves. And so the very first assignment is planing, right? And so you can see that we're building up. So you're going to make the thing until it's approved and it's correct. And so we have the instructions, and we list off the tools as well. And then so that was 1, and this is now 20 for the first term. And so by the end of the term, you're constructing molding. And it increased with difficulty along the way until your second term, you're creating a newel post, right? And so we don't have the remaining work like I said, for the last one. But we do see that the shop practices were part of Ricker's curriculum and thinking about education, and they were taught in conjunction. If we think about their talk with this, and they're taught in conjunction with the construction classes and Ricker's theory of textbooks. So I know you all think you have a lot of structures and construction classes now. This is what you would have taken in 1888, right? And so we can see the number of classes in the order of taken, and after completing the first year and the 3 shop classes, you took a year of construction courses along with drawing and watercolor, and by the time the student had reached the final year of curriculum, they had studied materials through making and shaping, the theory of construction and materials, the history of architecture, history was his favorite subject, by the way, and the tools to communicate. So in other words, the students had all of the pieces, and they would be asked to pull that together in their final year of design. And so it is through assignments. We also have bunches of assignments exist in the archives. So it's an assignment like this that would pull together the theory, the shop ideas, and into a drawing. So Ricker's influence, however, so we've talked about his influence as an architect, as an educator. He also influenced what was happening in Chicago. Ricker went up to Chicago quite regularly. We know he was in touch with people there. And we know in Chicago, some debate, but this may be the first skyscraper in Chicago in 1882, right? And so we know when Ricker is teaching, the world is changing. The world is changing quite rapidly. And so the complexity of buildings increase, the construction materials and innovation change, and even blueprinting starts. And so no longer do we need to hire people just to draw, right? So those skills were needed, but more than what people could do as drawings. And so training provided the greater number of practitioners, but Ricker's belief is that it needed to be rigorous. So beyond the intellectual ability, there needed to be a way to ensure that those calling themselves architects had sufficient knowledge, right? And so huckster was a word that was used quite at that time. Ricker saw the challenge. This is a challenge to the profession. He was deeply protective of the profession and to public safety. And the lack of construction knowledge was not only dangerous, but diminished the standing of the architect in public eyes. Thus, it was only natural when a licensing law for architects was posed in Illinois that he supported it. And so Illinois was the first state to enact a license law in July in 1897. Among the other requirements, such as exams and sealing drawings, the Illinois law required the Illinois State Board of Examiners of Architects, and here we see a photo here. The board was to be composed of 5 individuals with either over 10 years of practice experience or someone that belonged to the faculty of the University of Illinois. Inland Architect famously, a famous journal, famously said, we need men of undoubted integrity and the most esteemed for designing and structural knowledge. It should be pointed out that Ricker understood that licensing wasn't going to get you better buildings. He said if you wanted to design an abomination, you could still do that, but it meant that the buildings weren't falling down on people. We see Ricker, and then importantly, we see Dankmore Adler, right? So the Adler and Sullivan fame, who was one of the leaders on this effort. And then we have Reeves, Zimmerman, and P.B. White. On the first board of examiners, Ricker is on our far right. He served at this board for 20 years, and as I said, for 17 of those, he was chair. And so we can see that he's influencing the professionals in the state. We can see this by the inclusion of the Illinois faculty member in the license, in the law. The examinations would have a high knowledge of construction and systems that would be tested, and presumably he helped to author those. And Ricker's graduates didn't have to take that portion of the test. They were exempted, right? And so the first day was construction, sanitation, and strength of materials, and architects from our school did not have to do that. And so there was idea that this would be a long way to move buildings towards a standard of safety. So reflecting on Ricker's career, Clifford Ricker, there was a constant desire to shape the discipline of architecture. But alongside that, there was this conversation about what is an American architecture. And this started even as a student, and we know this because remarkably, Ricker has a column in the first student newspaper of the university. And so in November 1871, the first issue of the student newspaper, called The Student, included a piece by Ricker and his mechanical engineering student named Hatch, entitled American Architecture. And so Ricker and Hatch argued for the need of American style. However, they said they called out how we might understand what American style was. And he said, importantly, an American style had to be supported by the overall American populace. But the populace had to be educated, he thought. And so Ricker wanted to educate the public through a series of books of convenient form for each trade, containing full direction and the necessary instructions and explanations for executing all kinds of buildings in the best manner, giving the methods actually used in the various parts of the country. Right? So if everyone got to read that, then we'd all know what American architecture is supposed to be. This books would be plans, sketches, strengths and materials, proportioning, and the proper use of management of materials. Ricker and Hatch indicated in 1871 that such a work did not exist, only that the books were too general, too full of product advertisements, and too theoretical. And so, such a book, they said, architecture would see its rightful place among the highest of arts, should it exist. And so in 1871, he's already dreaming of this book, and we see this book manifest itself in Ricker's Elements of Construction. And so here's a foundation detail, an example of the drawings here. And so a great and distinctive American style can only be produced by the method of evolution in accordance with our materials, constructions, requirements. This method has been thoroughly successful to the case of the American house and the office building, and will be equally so with a new type of commercial architecture, i.e. skyscrapers in Chicago. So construction was always important to Ricker, and he taught the subject through rigorous architectural educations. He tested it through examination boards. He saw the importance in construction. The 1871 article shows that Ricker notably sketched out the need for a construction education as a student, and he would spend his life implementing it. The volumes of Element Construction illustrate his rigor, attention to detail, and the knowledge of contemporary architectural practices. It's also the idea of how do you build when the world is changing around you? You cover it all, he said. These volumes, like his pedagogy, are evidence of his leadership in architectural education and the architecture profession. How a building is built was essential to public safety. More importantly, it was the essence of American architecture. By the time that Ricker retired in 1916, construction education were being in a form that we recognize today, right? So if you go through here, and we've all had a construction textbook, you look at it, that was what was happening in the 1870s. Ricker's endeavors as a teacher and a lover of the profession had 80% of his students having careers in the building industry. And really the structure of his curriculum resonates in the school today, right? 150 plus years later. Henry Bacon, the designer of the Lincoln Memorial in DC, and whose only architectural education was at the University of Illinois, reflected on Ricker in Ricker's 50th anniversary at the university in 1922. Bacon noted Ricker's long distinguished career, but more importantly, congratulated him for being a bearer of light to those who follow. So as I wrap up, I want to say a little bit more about the book itself. I have the book, we could pass that. Actually, let's do that. In this book are the stories that I've started to tell you about Ricker. We published the construction textbook, which I'll pass around as well. And there are several chapters by these very fine authors on the right, one of which is in the room, Professor Thomas Leslie. And they contextualize, and what we did is we asked these authors to help us contextualize what was happening at the time. And so we have chapters that put what's happening in 19th century construction in Chicago. We have something on education, the state of the skyscrapers. We talk about, Tom Leslie talks about for foundations, we kind of didn't really know. And then for masonry, Rachel Will talks about standards of materials. So Ricker would literally talk about how you could go up and tap a material to hear if it was good or not. And so those standards will later become incorporated into things like the ASC standards that we use now. For the steel section, Friedman identifies the time capsule nature of the work. So if you imagine, there's cast iron, there's wrought iron, and there's steel, but architects were using all three of those still at the same time this book was written. And so that chapter, our expert in medical construction, says within that chapter that you can see texts, he can see texts that are written in the 1870s, and he can see the text that was written in the 1880s. And so all of these chapters really help contextualize the contribution and their individual and amazing contributions on their own. And so with that, I will let you know I have bookmarks for all of you. Have you passed them? Okay. This is for all of you. And then we have the book going around. And then I also have the photocopy of the original text. So if you want to see that, you can see that too. And you'll notice all my tabs are what I used in the proofing process. So with that, I will open it up. Thank you for your time and letting me share this story. It's an amazing, so Ricker in the 19th century was on the cutting edge, right? Even in the middle of the cornfields. And I'm happy to take any questions we have time. Yes?
So this is fascinating, and especially to derive this from the slide that you showed how much construction technology the U of I had versus MIT going out like this.
Yeah.
This runs very parallel to 2 generations later in architecture at Bauhaus.
Yes, yes.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And the call, like Collins, changing into modern architecture, talks about how even as early as 1840, there was a call for what's the new architecture and what's the American. So
Yes.
he seems to be right at the heart of all these different aspects. So I guess the question that I have is, was there anyone else who was doing what I always considered Bauhaus's innovation?
Yeah, so William Ware, who started MIT and then went and started Columbia, they had a Bauhaus instructor very early on at MIT, and when you read his notes in the AIA education minutes, he's trying to have as much art as he possibly can. And so each one of these programs, you can go back and reflect on their leaders very distinctly. And so MIT was desperately trying to do that. And then Ricker steps down as head in 1910. He has got some family stuff going on, changes are happening. And he goes to speak the Illinois Institute of Architects, and he says, I know it's coming, but I've held out sort of as long as I can to build the building, or to teach the way I think we should be building buildings. And then he steps down, and then shortly after that, Mann joins our faculty, who is very much a Beaux-Arts. He's in for a couple years, and then that changes. Mann notably prohibits women from studying architecture, and Ricker did not.
So White, ultimately, James White, ultimately been on the faculty.
1891, yeah.
Studied with Ricker.
Yes.
did he continue then this?
Yes, Ricker, so White
This
actually,
heavy construction?
well, so we know the construction changes in 1894, so there's things are happening, we're hiring other people, but White actually takes over the teaching of the construction course. So, and White was one of the people, White was James M. White worked with Ricker on Alkeld Hall and then became the campus architect. What other question? Yeah.
Do you know if there's a reason why we're so separated from engineering now as a school?
So when Ricker, for the entirety of Ricker's career, we were in the School of Architecture. And actually, I just found this out most recently. Architecture, this is not going to be surprising to the faculty here. Architecture decided that it no longer wanted to be part of the College of Engineering. It wanted to be its own college. And so what happened is the campus took a look at it, the campus senate, there's actually a Senate report on that, and the campus said, okay, you can come out of architecture, but you gotta be an FAA, you gotta be Fine Applied Arts. And so architecture, trying to swing out on its own, got this new composition. We are also the very first home of the first architectural engineering program in the country, some say spurred on by Adler in Chicago. And there was a huge battle about where that should live, because it was extremely successful in gaining the number of students, and so there was a turf battle between architecture and engineering as where that should live, and so it's always been an uneasy relationship. Tom.
What year was that?
1890.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, and so I have looked at MIT's records. We are before MIT, and I do have an article published on that too. Should you be interested? MIT asked me to look, so I looked. No, Kate.
So, like, we know that teaching architecture doesn't have to be in a university.
Right, yes.
But certainly in the US, that was kind of the context. Did Ricker reflect on that at all? Like what it meant to be teaching architecture in a university context as opposed to something else?
Yeah, and so actually all of the heads and the AIA Committee on Education did. AIA Committee on Education said, why do we have to take all of these non-purposeful classes? There was a nastier word used, right? Like, why should we make our students take chemistry? And so it's really been an uneasy fit from the beginning. And Ricker was very plain. He wasn't always verbose, but he was very plain spoken. And so he just kind of said, "This is where we are, and we're gonna do whatever we have to do to make it work." Other people fought that, and actually the AA committee thought we would have a grand école of architecture, and that never happened. And Ricker was speaking about this in 1910, so he started teaching in 1873. In 1910, he is still speaking about that they're still talking about having a national architecture school. But he said there's no funds, and actually none of the practitioners actually want to come and teach. They just want to practice. So it's been an uneasy relationship from the start, and even, right? So what else? Yes.
I was struck by what you said about not having access to good urban buildings or city buildings or something like that, and being in cornfields. It made me think that there's a shortage of buildings here, but there's probably also a shortage of instructors, especially for the shop practice. So I was wondering, who was teaching the shop practice courses, which were pretty specialized, and also when was that part of the curriculum discontinued?
It was continued in the 1890s, and so there's a shift in the curriculum in the 1890s, around 1894. So they stopped using Ricker's textbook and they stopped the shop practices. And I think it's alluding to what Kevin Hinders was saying, is we're trying to move towards the Beaux-Arts without moving to the Beaux-Arts. And who taught the shop practice? Ricker taught it. Ricker taught all of the courses from 1873 to 1891. So he's teaching history, he's teaching design, he's teaching all of these courses. And then someone, it's really interesting. So the architect, it's going to come to me, the architect that designed, I think, Noyes Hall was a student of Ricker's and then had some issues. And then Ricker hired him to run the wood shop. And in some of the assignments, I think it's Wells, in some of the assignments you can see his contribution. He's written on the assignments for the wood shop. Interestingly, Wells has 2 children, and he names them both that. Both children are named after Ricker. So the male one is named after Ricker, and the daughter is named after Ricker's wife and daughter.
How many students were there at that time?
not very many. I have a chart. I don't remember off my head, but not very many, right? So we're talking about 10 students in a class. But still, I mean, I would not want to teach the entire curriculum by myself. And then one thing I did want to point out, since we're all in the room. Okay, so I have in front of us 2 items that Ricker authored, right? And what you'll notice is that it's N. Clifford Ricker. It's not Nathan Clifford Ricker. It's N. Clifford Ricker. And even on his, here's a letter from his sister. So when we call him Nathan, that's not what he would have been called. I just wanted all the in-folks people to know that. So, yeah. Mary, oh, what? Yes, no, it was Ricker's time. And so, I'm sorry, Mary Louisa Page got an associate and then got a graduate degrees. And so I think we're the first there too, or very close, I can't remember. Ricker was agnostic towards women. Ricker's daughter went to school here, and she ended up drawing the drawings for one of his published works. So he's very agnostic about it. And then again, in around 1910, he's like, yeah, they're better students than the male students. But like I said, his predecessor came in and stayed for a couple years and kicked all the women out of the curriculum. So that was, so I don't really think he had a stand on it, but he didn't have an opposition either. Like, he didn't say that we should have women here. What else? Let's hear from a student. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and your attention and letting me share the story.